Topping our headlines on this Friday afternoon, President Yoon Suk-yeol has ended his diplomatic engagements in Spain, including the NATO summit and a host of multilateral as well as bilateral summits that touched upon security concerns and economic interests. Hong Kong today marks its 25th anniversary of return to China from Britain. Chinese President Xi Jinping is in the former British colony to commemorate the occasion. And South Korea has logged a trade deficit of $10.3 billion for the first half this year, staying on par for its first annual deficit since the financial crisis in 2008. It's good to have you with us. You're watching the Daily Report for Friday afternoon, the 1st of July here in South Korea. I'm Min Sun-hee. President Yoon Suk-yeol returned home Friday morning from the NATO summit in Spain, where he became the first South Korean president to partake in talks under the Western Security Alliance. Now, his three-day agenda in Madrid also included a host of multilateral and bilateral interactions with his European counterparts as well as regional counterparts. President Yoon also took part in a trilateral meeting with his U.S. counterpart Joe Biden and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. Now, in this next report, our senior presidential office correspondent Moon Gon-young highlights some of the remarks shared by President Yoon and his delegation in Madrid and the implications of South Korea's latest diplomatic interactions in the Spanish city.
South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol wraps up his three-day stay in Madrid, during which he attended a 30-membered military alliance summit, the first for a South Korean head of state. Here, the president, now less than 2 months in office, warned the NATO members of the threat to universal values at a time of new conflict and competition, a reference to Russia's aggression in Ukraine and China's engagement with Russia.
특정 국가를 거명하기보다 이런 자유와 인권, 법치를 중시하는 그런 규범에 입각한 질서가 존중되는 그런 협력을 우리 나토 국가들과 인태 국가들이 함께 연대해서 만들어 가야 된다.
South Korea's approach to NATO comes as the alliance is looking towards the Indo-Pacific, a new focus that Yoon's aides say the president welcomes. In its new strategic concept unveiled Wednesday, NATO, for the first time, described China as a challenge to its interests, security, and values, as an economic and military power that remains opaque about strategy, intentions, and military buildup. Beijing's envoy in Seoul fumed over the Western alliance's labeling of China as systemic challenge.
One of the goals we came to achieve at NATO this time is to establish a solidarity of values and norms. As the security situation of one region can spill over to the rest of the world, there is a clear need for countries around the globe to cooperate to together resolve an issue.
Experts agree that this reflects the Yoon administration's awareness of how the current security challenges the world is facing go far beyond the immediate challenges of North Korea, as we continue to see a concerted attempt to undermine democratic values globally. South Korea is well placed to reaffirm the importance of the liberal democratic values and successes of its democratic governments. President Yoon's presence at NATO is both a symbolic and practical reaffirmation of the confirmation to those values. 16 diplomatic engagements, big and small, over the course of 3 days. No immediate feat, if you ask, but
at the end of the day, I believe we've taken the right step forward in smoothly carrying out summit diplomacy for the next 5 years.
But this is just the beginning for President Yoon. Like his security advisor said, perhaps his decision to make the NATO summit his very first foreign trip perhaps reflects the situation South Korea and President Yoon stand in geopolitics, that a gray zone is no longer allowed. President Yoon will have to balance his relations with U.S. and China while dealing with a belligerent North Korea developing nuclear arms and missiles while improving ties with Japan. Moon Gon-young, Arirang News, Madrid.
And back on Thursday, that was his final and official day in Madrid. President Yoon held one-on-ones with his counterparts from Canada, the UK and the Czech Republic. My colleague Yoon Jung-min covers those bilateral exchanges.
South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol wrapped up his Spain trip on Thursday for this week's NATO summit with a series of sideline meetings, bolstering cooperation with partner countries for exports and North Korea's denuclearization. Meeting Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, President Yoon thanked Canada for its participation in the Korean War over 7 decades ago and mentioned a newly established monument in Canada to mark victory at the Battle of Gapyeong.
또 양국의 이런 우호를 바탕으로 해서 앞으로도 이런 첨단 기술, 인공지능, 에너지 이런 첨단 미래 산업으로 또 경제 안보 협력을 양국이 강화해 나갈 수 있을 것으로 생각합니다.
Canada is deeply engaged in the North Pacific and in the Indo-Pacific on a broad range of issues, and Korea is a very important partner to us.
The two leaders reaffirmed coordination for the denuclearization of North Korea, which Trudeau called a complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization. There also was a pull-aside meeting with the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, during which a bilateral framework for closer cooperation was adopted to strengthen cooperation in politics, economy, and culture. While bolstering cooperation on nuclear energy, the two leaders agreed to coordinate on digital trade and supply chain issues through more negotiation of their bilateral free trade agreement. Yoon also asked for support from the UK, a UN permanent member, on North Korea's nuclear issues. And during a meeting with the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, Petr Fiala, President Yoon asked for support so that Korean companies can make inroads into a Dukovany nuclear power plant project in that country, as well as support for Korea's bid to host 2030 World Expo in Busan. The Czech leader expressed hope over expanding cooperation with Korea on electric car batteries and hydrogen. Yoon also sat down with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, during which they shared a wish for stronger partnership between Korea and NATO, especially as South Korea newly sets up a diplomatic mission in Brussels. Also agreed was coordination against North Korea's nuclear programs. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
Also in Spain, there were reportedly some notable gains on talks with Poland regarding nuclear energy as the South Korean delegation sought to actively promote its sales diplomacy. Our Ji-young reports.
The first fruits of President Yoon Suk-yeol's sales diplomacy could be from Poland. Through bilateral meetings with world leaders in Spain on the NATO sidelines this week, President Yoon has been promoting the country's exports. Yoon has pledged to make South Korea a nuclear reactor superpower, and he used the NATO summit to discuss deals with his counterparts to export nuclear power plants.
First, we will go all out to win deals to build nuclear power plants in the countries that are about to choose contractors, including Poland and the Czech Republic.
During President Yoon's meeting with Polish President Andrzej Duda on Wednesday, Yoon emphasized Seoul's advanced and safe nuclear technology proven through the Baraka project in the United Arab Emirates. As part of this effort, South Korea's Industry Minister Lee Chang-yang also met on Thursday with his Polish counterpart. They signed a deal to form a joint committee and strengthen their cooperation on energy, including nuclear power, hydrogen, and e-mobility. Also at that meeting were officials from the two nations' major energy firms. 9 contracts were signed on nuclear energy between companies from the two countries, including South Korea's KEPCO and Poland's ILF. Earlier this week, during Lee's meeting with his Czech counterpart, 10 contracts were signed on nuclear energy and hydrogen between companies from the two countries, including the auto giant Hyundai Motor. One expert on nuclear energy says the projects in Poland and the Czech Republic could bring in billions of dollars to the South Korean economy.
Should South Korea export nuclear power plants to Europe, it could be deemed as the world's leading country in the field, both in name and reality.
Ji-young, Arirang News.
Up next, we take a moment now to share a few words with a pundit here regarding President Yoon's in-person diplomatic debut at NATO. For more, I have Professor Lim Yunchan at Koongju National University live on the line. Professor Im, it's good to have you with us. Professor, can you hear me? I believe your mic is not on, Professor Im.
Sorry.
Right. No, that's fine.
Thank you for having me. I'm sorry.
No, you're most welcome. Professor, before we touch upon President Yoon's remarks then, first, aside from denouncing Russia's atrocities in Ukraine, NATO leaders for the first time voiced concerns about the challenges posed by China. How do you explain this stance by NATO?
Well, I don't think this is a very sudden or abrupt change. Because we already saw some kind of signals or prologue already. For example, European Parliament, they recently published a report which is about the EU and the security challenges in the Indo-Pacific. Of course, it does have many important sectors that are related to the security challenges of European countries, especially in this region, in the Indo-Pacific. But one of the highlighted points was, again, the maritime security. That make a lot of senses to me because if you think about all the very dangerous and the bad situations in Europe now, they also need to diversify, for example, their energy supply. They have been probably too much dependent on the pipeline gas, natural gas from Russia. So for many European countries also, they need to again to diversify their energy supply as well. In the Pacific region, this is, of course, geographically speaking, it looks pretty distant, again, from the continental Europe. But if you think about all this technological development, especially in the field of transportation, this can be pretty closer now, to the European countries as well. So from their point of view, maritime security issue will be very, very much important, not only just for some military purposes, but also for their economic security, energy security issues too. So they really highlighted that point again, the maritime security issue or free navigation in the public ocean. So they already made up the conclusion with that specific report. So I won't be that surprised with this kind of how would you say the trend or changes we saw at the NATO summit.
Right, and staying with that, Professor Im, during his speech at the NATO summit, President Yoon Suk-yeol warned about the threat to universal values at a time of new conflict and competition, as my colleague Moon Gon-young mentioned earlier as well. Now, generally speaking, what are your thoughts regarding Yoon's address over in Madrid?
Well, again, there are still some controversies. Some will say, for example, NATO expanded too much, or that kind of NATO's expansion might have been regarded as offensive behavior or aggressive behavior from the Russia's point of view. So those critics will say that, again, that this war cannot be just solely, Russia is not the only one who made all this situation. But for them, I would like to just, strongly highlight that. But no matter what happened, no matter what the reasons are, again, Russia was the one actually who invaded some other countries' territory and sovereignty with the force and with violence, which is obviously, needless to say, that's against the international law. So Korea, South Korea, again, the Republic of Korea, was a victim, actually, of that kind of aggression many decades ago. So how can the South Korea, Republic of Korea-like country not be defensive or not defend those kind of international law or all this, values and norms? We are again, the South Korea is really representative example that has survived out of all this, ashes after the Korean War. So I strongly, of course, I know, that there can be some criticism about the President Yoon's that kind of comment, but for me, or as a South Korean national, I cannot just agree more, with my president's that view or that comment.
Right. And staying with his comments, Professor Im, he also called for a concerted effort against North Korea's missile and nuclear weapons ambitions. How do you assess President Yoon's proactive policy with regard to denuclearization here on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, I think that was necessary too. We don't want to be aggressive, or we don't want to be offensive to any of our neighboring countries. Again, China definitely is an important partner and still, the biggest trade partner. And even regarding the North Korea-related issue, China's support and the cooperation with China is indispensable. So we don't want to be again offensive to China or even to Russia. But again, the North Korea's that kind of consecutive missile test, for example, they have conducted the missile test 18 times, during the first half of this year. So that kind of number is really outrageous, and it is more than just just provocation. It's really threatening, the security of not only just of South Korea, of Japan, or even of China, or even with other, those East Asian countries, or even Indo-Pacific country. So we, again, need to be really more cooperative and interactive with our neighboring countries to deal with this serious challenge, again, made by the North.
Right, and with those concerns in mind, of course, Professor Im, trilateral talks among the leaders of Seoul here, Washington and Tokyo were held over in Madrid as well, for the first time, that is, in almost 5 years. How do you envision future trilateral ties, as well as bilateral ties, perhaps, between Seoul and Tokyo?
Well, I did have a chance to travel to Tokyo briefly a few weeks ago, and I had a chance to meet some Japanese MOFA people or some politicians or other experts. We all have common concerns about the challenges made by North, as I just mentioned. So this cooperation is really necessary. Well, even though, there are some critical voices, even in this country as well, but this is a necessary step. But my concern is, again, still the historical disputes, especially more specifically speaking, the forced labor, that issue is really holding back all this further cooperation or trust between Korea and Japan. So I cannot be just solely optimistic about the bilateral relations because of the ongoing problems with Japan. But again, those multilateral cooperation to deal with the challenges by North, that I think is more than just necessary.
Right, and speaking about multilateral cooperation, Professor Im, along with South Korea and Japan, Australia and New Zealand were also invited to the NATO summit. Do you suppose this attempt by NATO to perhaps reach out to its democratic allies here in this part of the world ultimately pits this bloc against China and Russia, perhaps under the BRICS framework? And if that is the case, surely this division, that is, Professor Im, is not ideal in terms of global stability and security. What do you say?
Well, again, I don't want to blame some specific country all the time. But again, if you think about the sequence, again, Russia was the one who invaded, again, the Ukraine's territory. So who really started this, right? So I don't think we should not be really confused, I think, with all these, occasions. NATO's outreach to the Indo-Pacific region or Indo-Pacific democratic countries in this region, that is, again, one necessary process U.S. to deal with this really a serious and real challenge made by, again, the Moscow and the President Putin. I probably cannot agree with that kind of view. Again, we are now trying to make a block against China or against Russia. Again, rather, I would say, who really started all this thing. So again, we also need to protect our own people and our own territory and our own freedom, and then our system too. So I think we are more, reactive rather than just proactively aggressive to somebody else.
Right, a valid point then. All right, Professor Im at Kongju National University, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Right, well, that brings us to the end of part one. In part two, we address the raging global inflation and efforts to address it. Stay with us.
Share South Korea's experience in tackling COVID-19 and introduce a Korean new Korean survivor of Japan's wartime slavery met with
extraordinary climate crisis and pledged to work with the EU to tackle the challenge.
The objective of its North Korea policy is
protesters gathering across the country to peacefully demand an end to hate and violence.
Arirang, what matters?
Feel so good right now. Maybe I had a drink or two, but this somehow feels like it's forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now. Maybe this is forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now. Forever.
Welcome back. Inflation was initially driven by post-pandemic supply shortages, which have since been aggravated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, inflation has expanded across the board to affect everything from food on tables to cars on roads to summer holiday plans. For more, I have Professor Matthew Khan at the University of Southern California live on the line. Professor Khan, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Hello. Thank you.
Right, Professor Khan, let's begin then with the situation over in Europe, where inflation, I believe, is running at a record 8.1% in the 19 countries that use the euro. Could you tell us more?
So Macroeconomics is such an important field, and there are such important issues going on today. Gasoline in Germany with a price of $7.50 a gallon. What I see in Europe is easy money, the European Central Bank printing money, this lowering interest rates and this stimulating a demand for assets, raising real estate prices, and governments across Europe trying to offset the COVID recession by running fiscal stimulus, this creating deficits and this creating this Keynesian aggregate demand driving up prices during a time of supply chain woes and rising energy prices associated with the war in Russia and the Ukraine right now. And so just this culmination of many events, this tsunami of many events simultaneously taking place, lowering the quality of life of the middle class throughout Europe.
Right. And do you see the similar scenario also taking place over in the U.S., where I believe U.S. President Joe Biden has suggested a temporary fuel tax halt, which, of course, in itself has also led to a bit of debate, Professor Khan?
That is correct. And so the Biden administration has good intentions. The Biden administration wants this win-win of economic growth, lower unemployment, and low inflation. But I am concerned that while the Biden administration has good intentions, we don't know enough about the science of macroeconomics to know the path ahead. I think a crucial issue is expectations. We have an election coming up in November. There's disagreement between the Republicans and the Democrats. And right now, the Federal Reserve has had an easy money policy. Perhaps we had too large of a stimulus package last year. And this combination of supply and demand effects has created inflation in our system. For over 30 years, we didn't have inflation in the United States, and now we have inflation of roughly 8%, lowering the well-being of our middle class. And the Biden administration is seeking out different policies to adapt to this challenge that we face.
Right. And while governments are trying to do that, the public, for their part, I mean, there is this growing sense of financial insecurity. It's prompting quite a number of protests across countries. South Korea, for its part, saw truckers striking before reaching a deal with relevant authorities. What is the situation like elsewhere, Professor? And do you see this phenomenon persisting for the time being?
So in the UK, we've seen railroad strikes. And at least in my Los Angeles, the middle class face many challenges, and we face a challenge going forward that inflation is a tax on the middle class. The purchasing power of a dollar declines. And so I think we will see growing protests, and this will affect the U.S. election in November. And the politicians mean well here, but what we really need is policies to get us back to economic growth. Policies that get the U.S. deficit under control, entitlement programs like Social Security to get these under control, and the Federal Reserve committing to a policy of trying to fight inflation, going back to Paul Volcker, and trying to reestablish credibility that the Fed and the Congress can work together to bring about an expectation of stability so that investors can invest with confidence, so that we have the supply side of the economy to create jobs, to lower unemployment, such that young people can have a bright future going forward.
Right. Professor Khan, in the meantime, though, as part of efforts to perhaps return some spending power to its people, California, for its part, is poised to send relief checks of up to $1,050 to qualifying residents. Of course, what more can you tell us about this effort?
So while this is well-intentioned by Governor Newsom in California, I view this as a Band-Aid. This is a relatively small amount of money. Perhaps some people will use it to buy a new Samsung phone. So there's interesting questions of who will gain the bulk of that money. But at the end of the day, this is a well-intentioned policy, but I think that this is just a Band-Aid. What the people of California need is a commitment to fiscal stability and to get back to the basics, that the U.S. economy grew sharply during a time when inflation was under control and there was an expectation that you could invest with confidence. And right now, with all the uncertainty of the United States, this is having this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that the uncertainty is feeding on itself. And we need the Congress, the Federal Reserve, and the executive branch, President Biden, we need the polarization in Washington, D.C. to decline, and for these individuals and entities to work together to get us a credible macroeconomic policy going forward that creates rules of the game that encourage investment in human capital, investment in real estate capital, and investment in physical capital to start to rebuild the U.S. economy such that our economy grows faster, and that benefits our allies, such as South Korea.
Right. Professor Khan, central banks here, as well as in the US, of course, and over in Europe, are all expected to raise interest rates to stem inflation. Now, do you suppose these rate hikes are the only option on the table to fight soaring consumer prices?
So this is a great question. We teach our undergraduates at the University of Southern California this Phillips curve. And to remind you, this is sort of this, it's taught like a law of physics that when you drop an apple, that the rate the apple falls to the ground. The Phillips curve claims that there is this smooth relationship that for unemployment to be lower, we need to have, there's this trade-off. If we have high inflation, we can have lower unemployment, or we can have low unemployment. And so with this Phillips curve, there's now a debate in macroeconomics of whether it really exists. And so I actually don't know the answer to your question. I am a humble economist, and I think that economists going forward need to be more honest with the public about our own uncertainty about how the macroeconomy works. What I am certain of is, again, if the monetary authorities and the fiscal authorities return to fiscal stability and to a money policy that builds credibility, that there won't be hyperinflation in the U.S., then investors will invest with confidence and economic growth will continue. And so the long run effects of recession will be smaller the faster we gain credible policy of having our budget deficit under control and resetting expectations for investors.
Right, and staying with that then, Professor Khan, where do you stand on the debate regarding the wisdom of risking a recession to rein in perhaps inflation?
So this is a very tricky issue. I am privileged. As a college graduate, it's rare for people like me to be unemployed in the U.S. So I am a fan of taming inflation. Inflation is a tax on everybody's cash, but there's no free lunch. To tame inflation, there will be a higher unemployment rate, and that will affect America's less educated population on average. But where I stand, to be bold and to not be a two-handed economist, I support the U.S. and other nations slaying this inflation dragon, because this will more quickly get us back to long-run economic growth. And at the end of the day, economic growth is the key for reducing poverty and improving the quality of life of the middle class. Economists celebrate the success of South Korea of showing the power of economic growth to improve everyone's quality of life. And during a time of inflation and uncertainty, this will lower economic growth unless monetary and macro authorities reestablish credibility going forward.
And very briefly speaking then, Professor Khan, do you expect things to get worse on the inflation front before they get better?
Yes. Unfortunately, I am worried here, but I am not a good bettor. I lose money on the Super Bowl. What's crucial is the American election coming up. The polarization in the United States has not helped the macroeconomic debate. Larry Summers and some terrific economists are giving very good ideas, but I don't know if their ideas are influencing public policy right now. What we need in the United States right now is a commitment to low inflation and getting back to economic growth. And this is the key. The U.S. continues to be an engine of the world's economic growth. And so it's crucial that the U.S. get its house in order.
Right. And before you go, Professor Khan, I'm aware that you have a book about how flexible working hours could perhaps improve the life of workers across the world, of course. Could you tell us a bit about that before you leave us?
Yes, I have a star Korean student, Eun-ji Kwon, and I've spoken to her about remote work. And so I have visited Seoul, and I know that Seoul is a superstar city. Briefly, what my book is about is, with the rise of work from home, people in other parts of Korea can live there and teleport or work remotely for these Seoul firms. Home prices are very high in Seoul. So what my book is about is this ability to work for superstar firms in Seoul while being with your mother in another city, while living where real estate prices are cheaper in another city. So my book is about the new possibilities created by the work from home economy, and that a silver lining of the COVID crisis is we've discovered how much we can gain from work from home. And with my South Korean student, Unji Kwan, I'm learning about this subject and hope that other Korean scholars want to work with me on this.
I see. All right. Professor Khan, thank you very much for your kind words, and thank you very much for your thoughts on the inflation as well.
Thank you. Good night.
On the international front, today, that is July 1st, commemorates the 25th anniversary of Britain's return of Hong Kong to Chinese rule. Now, to mark the occasion, Chinese leader Xi Jinping arrived in the former British colony on Thursday. Our Kim Hyo-sun reports.
President Xi Jinping arrived in Hong Kong Thursday, a day before the official ceremony celebrating the 25th anniversary of the British handover of the island. After arriving by train, Xi explained how Hong Kong has overcome numerous challenges over the years.
In the past few years, Hong Kong has withstood severe tests again and again, overcoming risks and challenges one by one. After the wind and rain, Hong Kong has risen from the ashes and also demonstrated a high level of vigor and vitality.
He also stressed that the one country, two systems will bring a brighter future to Hong Kong. Under Xi's leadership, Beijing has reshaped Hong Kong during the past 2 years, cracking down on protests and freedom of speech. A more patriotic curriculum has been introduced at schools. Marking the occasion, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson accused Beijing of failing to keep its promises.
But on the 25th anniversary of the handover, we simply cannot avoid the fact that for some time now, Beijing has been failing to comply with its obligations. It's a state of affairs that threatens both the rights and freedoms of Hong Kongers and the continued progress and prosperity of their home.
In a video message posted on Twitter, he stressed that his country was not going to give up on Hong Kong. The anniversary marks the halfway point of the 50-year governance model agreed upon between London and Beijing. But the UK has become increasingly critical of Chinese rule there, especially following Beijing's implementation of a harsh national security law in 2020. Washington also criticized China's Hong Kong policies. The spokesperson of the U.S. National Security Council said in a statement Thursday that the world is witnessing a dismantling of Hong Kong's democratic institutions, as well as unprecedented pressures on many areas. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
Here in South Korea, authorities have lifted rain alerts across the country as the torrential storm has subsided. As of 3 a.m. Friday, the weather warning earlier issued by the Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasure Headquarters was lifted. The heavy rain nonetheless took 3 lives and damaged more than 160 roads while inundating some 100 houses. Also, sporadic showers are in the forecast for the central region later on this Friday, and officials have thus called for vigilance. Also, the local front findings for the first 6 months of this year show South Korea's trade in the red. In fact, the country logged a deficit of over $10 billion despite posting a stellar performance on the export front. Our Shin Ha-young explains.
South Korea's trade deficit in the first half of this year recorded an all-time high since the first half of 1997. Data from the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy shows the country's trade deficit hit $10.3 billion in the first 2 quarters as imports exceeded exports. The ministry reported on Friday that exports from the first half of this year came to around $350 billion, up 15.6% on year. This figure marked an all-time high in the first half of any year as global demand rebounded. Exports of goods from 14 major categories except for ships saw an increase. In particular, the hike in exports were led by semiconductors and petrochemicals. Outbound shipments of semiconductors soared 20.8% to $69 billion, while exports of petrochemicals rose 16% to around $30 billion. Other export items such as steel and petroleum products posted significant growth as well. Meanwhile, soaring energy prices pushed up imports to about $361 billion, up 26.2% on year. The Trade Ministry says this is mainly due to a hike in energy and raw material prices. It also added that countries like Japan and France, which also depend on other countries for their oil and gas needs, are seeing a trade deficit as well. 신하영, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, following weeks of tangible retreat in daily COVID-19 infections, South Korea has been noting a subtle rebound in recent days. The Prime Minister himself has acknowledged this reality and pledged to streamline the country's response strategy. Our Han Sung-woo has more.
South Korea will increase the number of so-called one-stop COVID-19 treatment centers from just over 6,200 now to 10,000. The centers are facilities where people can get tested, receive in-person medical attention, and be prescribed antiviral drugs, all in one visit.
Even as COVID-19 case numbers rise, we will make sure patients can be treated in a stable manner under the nation's general medical system.
At a Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasure Headquarters briefing Friday morning, Prime Minister Han Duck-soo also vowed to better manage the nationwide distribution of hospital beds by installing joint response situation rooms and bringing up the recent uptick in COVID-19 cases after a 14-week downward trend. He cautioned against the threat of variant strains and reinfections. South Korea reported 9,528 new cases on Friday, 67 less than the day before, but around 2,300 more than last Friday's figure, raising concerns that another surge is on the horizon. There were 8 more related deaths, raising the death toll since the start of the pandemic to 24,555. Han Sung-woo, Arirang News.
The Yoon administration has unveiled a broad framework of initiatives aimed at tackling the cost of living as well as supporting new industries. Iraeon has details.
The government's announced a number of important measures for the second half of the year to help consumers and the economy. The Ministry of Finance said Thursday that to give some relief to drivers paying record-high fuel prices, it's likely to increase the tax cut on fuel to the legal limit of 37%. The tax cut right now is at 30%. This will bring down gasoline prices by around 4 US cents a liter and diesel by about 3 cents. The Financial Services Commission is going to expand its support for people who, because of the pandemic, are struggling to keep up with their loans while they're self-employed or running a small business. From October, many will be eligible for lower interest rates and principal payments. Also, to help more people get on the property ladder, the rules will be eased on borrowing. The government is going to raise the limit on loan-to-value for mortgages to 80% for first-time homebuyers. Right now, it's at 60 to 70%.
When the LTV ratio was 70%, it was still hard for first-time buyers to make a down payment of 30%. The new measure will help these people, but there are still other problems like high interest rates.
The Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy will also take steps from August to protect and grow several high-tech strategic industries like semiconductors, batteries, and vaccines. These will include stabilizing supply chains for high-tech items and boosting government support for related companies. The ministry also aims to launch a task force to accelerate what it calls the industrial digital transformation. There is a new pilot project for the Ministry of Health and Welfare, too. From July, people in 6 designated cities and districts, including Jongno-gu District in Seoul, can apply for benefits when they're sick or injured and miss work. They'll get almost 44,000 won a day, or about $34 US. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, meanwhile, is going to use leftover stock to let people get the older green version of the Korean passport for a cheaper fee. And from July, national ID cards are going digital, so a smartphone version can be used with the same legal validity as a physical one. The app is called Government 24, and so far it's available for Android only, but an iOS version will be out soon. Lee Hyun, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. Ketanji Brown Jackson has become the first black woman to be appointed to the United States highest court. The 51-year-old Harvard graduate will replace Associate Justice Stephen Breyer on the Supreme Court. The 116th Justice will become the 6th woman and 3rd black person to serve on the Supreme Court since 1789, when it was founded. She will join the liberal bloc of the court with a 6-3 conservative majority. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that the Environmental Protection Agency does not have the authority to require states to decarbonize their electricity sectors. The decision, made in a 6-3 vote on Thursday, is likely to hinder the U.S.'s ability to curb emissions and meet its target of limiting temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030. This comes after West Virginia, along with 18 other mostly Republican states and a number of major coal companies, sued the Environmental Agency over an Obama-era regulation called the Clean Power Plan. The measure was meant to reduce greenhouse gases from coal-fired power plants, but it never took effect due to ongoing legal challenges. A judge in Florida has blocked the state from enforcing bans or restrictions on abortion. This follows the state's new law banning abortions after the 15th week of pregnancy, which was due to come into effect on July 1st. Florida is one of the many states looking to bring in new laws following the U.S. Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade a week earlier. However, a Tallahassee-based circuit court judge said on Thursday that the state's new law is unconstitutional. The judge made the decision following a petition from abortion rights groups meant to temporarily stop the ban. For now, abortion in Florida will remain legal until the 24th week of pregnancy. More petitions have been filed in other states by abortion rights groups to try and halt the so-called trigger laws, designed to come into effect when Roe v. Wade was overturned. The Philippines wakes up this morning to a new president as Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has officially been sworn in. The ceremony on Thursday restored one of the country's most notorious political dynasties 36 years after the ousting of Marcos Jr.'s father, the former dictator Ferdinand Marcos. Speaking during his inauguration, the new president praised the accomplishments of his father, promising to emulate him and fulfill his campaign pledges.
We will build back better by doing things in the light of the experiences that we have had, both good and bad. It doesn't matter. No looking back in anger or nostalgia.
His election victory from May 9th came as the result of a decades-long effort to alter public perceptions of the family. A casting of one of the world's most iconic sculptures in the world, August Rodin's The Thinker, has been sold for $11.1 million. Going under the hammer in Paris on Thursday, the piece of art met selling estimates from Christie's auction house, which predicted it would fetch between $9 to $14 million. It is one of roughly 40 authentic castings which were enlarged from the original 70-centimeter tall piece after it gained prominence. Originally made in 1880, The Thinker was initially called The Poet by the French sculptor and was meant to represent the Italian philosopher Dante. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good Friday afternoon. The heavy rain has given way to extreme heat with heat advisories across the country. Highs are 8 degrees higher than yesterday, so keep yourself cool and hydrated, even at night, to protect yourself from heat-related illnesses. Well, overall, it's going to be murky across the country, and unsettled air means there will be showers in some inland regions with up to 60 millimeters of the rain falling, and could be followed by stormy conditions. And due to the torrential downpours, the ground has become soft in places, so please be careful to avoid such areas. And another issue is the third typhoon of the season, Chaba, which could indirectly affect Korea, and a tropical low-pressure system moving northward. And these could result in extremely heavy rain, so keep yourself up to date with the weather forecast in your area. And it's going to be oppressively hot during the weekend with Seoul reaching 34 degrees, and the rain will return early next week. Have a great weekend, and now let's take a look at the worldwide weather conditions.
That ends this week's editions of the Daily Report. Thank you for watching. Have a safe weekend and do join us again starting from next Monday.